Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russell Rawlings, statewide community organizer at the Disability Organizing Network. CFILC's Disability Organizing Network is an organization comprised of advocates and disability rights activists throughout the state of California. And we're glad to bring you this webinar today, which is the first in the series of 2020 election education webinars. This one begins with some basics on getting started with disability voting advocacy by building a toolkit. And just like to kind of outline the goals for this webinar. The first is understanding the role of your county elections office, building a disability voting accessibility advisory committee, or VAAC, and understanding the role of the election administration plan. This is the first section of our webinar where we will be engaging with Courtney Bailey, Sacramento County Registrar of Voters. I'm now going to turn it over to Courtney.
Okay, thank you very much, Russell, and of course, Megan, and everyone that put all this together. So if Russell, you want to go ahead and advance, perfect. All right, so, just to get a basic understanding of what the elections office does is important to help work towards an increased transparency of elections, as well as accessibility of elections. So just to give you an overview of kind of what the election officials are responsible for on a county level, it's several different aspects, including registering to vote, of course, and maintaining the voter files. Petitions as well, we're responsible for those. Campaign filing and reporting, create and mailing ballots to all registered voters. So those of you that might know, for this November election statewide, all registered voters are going to receive a ballot in the mail in California. However, Sacramento County has been doing this since 2018 with the implementation of the Voters' Choice Act. So we automatically mail a ballot to every registered voter in our county. We still, of course, have and provide in-person voting opportunities, including over multiple days. Again, that's due to the Voters' Choice Act changes that were made in 2018. It's also upon us to tabulate and audit all of our election results. And last but definitely not least is community outreach and engagement, because that is really what we learn or how we learn what is going on out there, what are the concerns, what are the issues, and what are the things we need to address. And especially when it comes to accessibility, we need that community outreach and engagement. So our goals as election officials is to eliminate barriers so all voters can vote independently and privately. That's kind of the overarching goal. And this can include many different things, including physical access, the accessibility of marking ballots privately and independently, and even the accessible vote by mail system, which we'll be talking about. And I know our friends from Disability Rights California will be talking about that as well. So Russell, go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so the first step for that community engagement and outreach is creating a voting accessibility advisory committee. This is very important to allow voters, to allow advocates, to allow community members to have a say and understanding on how elections are conducted in your jurisdiction. There are a lot of different aspects that go into an election, and so it's important that we have these community engagement committees to help us as election officials make the best choices with the resources that we have. So the first aspect on creating a voting accessibility advisory committee is to reach out to community partners and advocates. It is required under the Voters' Choice Act that a county that does conduct elections under the Voters' Choice Act have a voting accessibility advisory committee, or VAAC. Other election counties are encouraged to have a VAAC or some sort of iteration of a VAAC, but it is required under the Voters' Choice Act. So we actually started with our county disability compliance office, and they helped us really to step off creating a voting accessibility advisory committee. The purpose of this committee is for election officials to learn about the barriers to voting. A lot of times election officials make decisions kind of in a vacuum, and this is where we need the input of the public to hear those real experiences of what voters are seeing out in the field. It's also important when creating a voting accessibility advisory committee to have goals. If you're going to invite people to serve on a committee, it's important to really establish what those goals are. And of course, you can do that with help of the committee and change them over time as times change. But it's important to get an idea of what do you want out of this? And it's important to work with the election official to both understand what maybe an advocate might want from this, what a voter might want from this, and what an election official wants out of this. So we then move into recruitment. So we have the idea, we want to start this committee. How do we recruit for members? Again, we worked with our county disability compliance office. We also worked with local organizations to create or to ask for assistance from organizations such as Disability Rights California, Resources for Independent Living, city agencies as well. A lot of cities have some sort of a disability compliance office already, and they really helped us. Also, any other organization that provides services to people with disabilities can be a very effective partner in creating your voting accessibility advisory committee. So taking the time to create it, to create the goals, and working with different organizations to figure out what you want from this committee and what you want to see the elections office provide out of it as well. We really need participation in order for these to work. So a few of the different topics that is covered in our Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee is physical accessibility. So when we are looking at our in-person voting locations, are they accessible? Do they meet ADA requirements? What things do we have to consider when we're going out to look at the physical accessibility of a location? Something that was new to me while learning about barriers was the fact that wheelchair lifts on uneven parking can really be an issue in order to park and be let down safely. So when we go out and physically survey these locations, it was really eye-opening to hear about those different personal experiences so that when we go back out and physically survey, which was something I did in this department for many years, it really gave us a better idea of things we need to look for when we're physically surveying a location. We also need the VAAC input with voting equipment. Is this equipment actually useful? Is it beneficial? What are some issues? Under the California Secretary of State, voting system standards are very strict, some of the strictest in the country, which is a good thing and makes me thankful to be in California. But with that, doesn't always mean the actual usability is as effective. So it's important to get feedback from members of the community to see really the usability of that equipment. Website accessibility. Is the website easy to navigate? Is it easy to read? Do all the pictures have the alt text? And there are a lot of even free evaluations that are done out there, but it's important to get, again, your local community's feedback on the accessibility of your website. Alternate formats. Some folks don't even know what's available from a county election official in terms of alternate materials. So we try to get the word out there, and we need our VAAC members to help us. How do we let folks know what we do provide in terms of large print, in terms of accessible vote by mail in the county voter information guide, audio measures, what information is available on the state level, even alternate methods to voting like curbside voting. A lot of voters don't know that we have these services. So how do we get the word out? The accessible vote by mail and county voter information guide are both valuable tools in creating an accessible election. It is now required through the state of California that every county provides an accessible vote by mail option. And with it, we have our accessible county voter information guide as well that is compatible with screen readers. And again, we needed our VAAC and other community members to help us make sure that really these items are usable. Outreach and demonstrations, the VAAC plays a major role in helping us find outreach events, how to message, how do we advertise what accessible vote by mail is. Sometimes it gets called online voting, it gets called a lot of other things too. How do we talk about this? And we really need community partners to help us discuss what these options are and how to advertise for them. And of course, education. I think our first few VAAC meetings were pretty instruction heavy, just to get everyone kind of to all be on the same page and understanding of what election officials do. What are the barriers and restrictions that county election officials face mainly in terms of resources, timing, and of course the money plays into the resources. But then also educating election officials again on your experiences and what you see out in the community. So it's really important when you're building a VAAC that trust and collaboration is key if you want to see success. And success does not always happen quickly, as the members of our Sacramento County VAAC know. On the screen, there is a picture of a few of our VAAC members, including Russell, including me, and even one of our Board of Supervisors, outside of Ileton Community Center, which is a community center in the south area of the county. And this community center was had all sorts of physical barriers, a lot of accessibility issues, and it took us a while to get those upgrades done for the March election. So this picture is from the last March primary election. After those upgrades were completed, and we're there happily that we finally got this completed, but it took 2 years to get to that point. So it doesn't always mean things happen fast, but it is important that we continue working towards the same goal and we do see results. So really the first big thing when creating any sort of committee is listening to each other. Listening and understanding the county perspective, and also listening and understanding from the different members of your VAAC. And it is good to try and get a diverse group of members, especially since, of course, as we know, disabilities vary. And so to try and get representation throughout the board is very important in order to help make the best decisions. Now, we do have quite a few standing members, but we also have a lot of public participation, especially from those who are blind or have low vision. So while they're not a member, they can still actively contribute and provide feedback because they regularly attend the meetings. So it's good to have, again, even if you don't have an actual member or they can't commit to being a member, to try and get a robust, diverse group in order to help open your eyes and see what you can accomplish together and make sure you cover everything. It's important to be honest and share personal experiences. So I try to, when working with our VAAC, to let them know, you know what, there might be a resource issue here. I don't know if that's feasible. There might be a timing issue here. We don't want to ever shut anything down right away, but we want everyone to know what the barriers are. And again, as I mentioned, it is important to have those personal experiences as well. What is it like to vote if you are blind or if you have low vision? What are you experiencing? And because until you share that, the election official is not going to be able to make those changes and setup. It's also important things like chairs is kind of the most basic example where members of our committee said, hey, we need more chairs where we have our vote centers and in-person voting locations. And that sounds like such a simple thing that we overlooked because we were so inundated and focused on the election side that we missed making sure that we could provide adequate space for voters to sit while waiting. So even things like that, which might sound simple and basic, are things to bring to the election officials' attention. Action plans and follow-ups important, and we do ask for help in these items. We want to make sure the committee agrees on the action that we are taking and moving forward with, and making sure that we all follow up on our tasks, whether it's the election official or members of the committee if they've agreed to help or complete a certain task. And that could be contacting organizations, that could be revising some verbiage, that could be website review, all these things that can be done to help improve elections. Transparency, and then this falls more on your election official side, to make sure that the VAAC understands how elections are conducted and what we do to safeguard the election. As you all know, there's a lot of misinformation out there about elections. So this is an opportunity to increase transparency as well as accessibility on how elections are conducted. Scheduling, to work with your members for scheduling and making sure you have agendas. Regular attendance and participation is crucial. As really to move forward, you don't want to go and rehash the same topics over and over in order to have an effective VAAC meeting. We're all there, whether you're a member or an election official. Usually they're after hours, sometimes they're during the day, but a lot of times they're after hours, and we're all doing it on our own time. We want to make sure it's as effective as possible. So regular participation is really important to move forward for things like getting the accessibility upgrades done in Ileton. Hold your election official accountable. Just from the fact that the election official might be being polled in different ways, I know for one, I have definitely dropped the ball on things. And so I rely on the VAAC members to help me and remind me and help focus me on the things that we really want to prioritize moving forward. And then help where you can, whether it's even taking notes at the meeting, reminding your election official to follow up, or contacting community organizations, doing some research, doing some reviews. Any help that you're able to provide to the election official is very much appreciated. Next slide. So another aspect from moving from our VAAC into our election administration plan. Again, this is something that is required for counties that have adopted the voting model called the Voters' Choice Act, where every registered voter gets a ballot in the mail. So this is required in order to increase public input and transparency. And the plans cover a whole lot of different things, including how to administer an election, election activities, cybersecurity, verifying vote-by-mail ballots, election results and auditing, outreach, education, budget, and resources and contact information. So our plan is pretty long, but it does also focus on an area specifically in code just to address voters with disabilities. So voters with disabilities, it covers a lot of different aspects in the election administration plan. And again, it's actually in code on what things to address. One of them, of course, is a voting accessibility advisory committee, making sure that the counties establish one and what those goals are going to be. And of course, that is something that you're going to want to work with the election official and your fellow members on what you want out of that committee. Education workshops. How do we provide education to voters and voters with disabilities on their voting options, on the voting equipment, and on alternate formats? Media and advertising. This has been very challenging to find different media outlets that can reach different sorts of disabilities. And we've worked a lot with a lot of local organizations to help us, but it definitely takes time. It's a little bit different than working with our Language Accessibility Advisory Committee, for example, as we have a lot of information there, like radio stations that might service voters who speak Spanish, or magazines that service voters that might speak Chinese. But for voters with disabilities, it's more challenging on how to reach those sort of demographics. And again, trying to understand the different disabilities that are out there and how to reach them. Alternate formats. Again, in order to increase transparency and in order to let voters know what we do provide, how do we let them know that? What is available? And we put that in our election administration plan, and then we ask for help in getting that information out there to the voters. And it's something that before we never really detailed what we had or what's available. So this election administration plan gave us that opportunity. Accessible voting options, whether or not it's accessible vote by mail, which allows for voters to go online and make their ballot selections using their own assistive technology. They can then print off their ballot choices. Well, in California, you have to print off your ballot choices and send that in. In order to explain again what that is, that it's not internet voting, we detail it in our election administration plan. We also talk about what services are available at the vote centers, the equipment that's going to be available for voters for voting in person, especially as voting equipment varies from county to county. So what we do in Sacramento is not necessarily what they're going to do or what voters are going to see in our neighbor in Yolo County or what you're going to see in LA County. Curbside voting. A lot of voters don't realize they have the opportunity to vote curbside, which basically just means you can stay in your car, you can stay outside the voting area, make your choices out there, and then the vote center staff or poll worker will help you go through the process and turn your ballot in for you. But again, how do folks know that that service is out there? Also, the election administration plan talks about addressing gaps in participation. And this has been very valuable in order to help us target what areas do we need to work on in terms of voter outreach. Who's not getting the message? Who's not getting the information? Or who's still facing barriers to voting? And we talk about that and how we're going to address that in our election administration plan. Finally, it also talks about how we evaluate and come up with our vote center and ballot drop box locations. So our vote centers, we call vote centers, that replace the one-day only polling places. Vote centers are open for multiple days with multiple services available. Well, in order to make sure that we select the best possible location, we actually go through a series of rankings based on information that we have from the census and the voter file. So again, census, very important. So it's important to fill out your census because county election officials look at that when we're making decisions on where is the best place to put locations. And of course, voter file information, while we track languages, we track age, we track places of birth that we have, we don't have any data on voters with disabilities or what kind of a disability a voter might have. So we really rely on the census in order to help us with that information, to fill in some of that information. Sometimes voters will contact us, letting us know, but for the most part, we don't know that information. And one of the requirements in the Voters' Choice Act is we do look at where voters with disabilities are. And that's where we rely on census and American Community Survey data. So all these things that we look at with our election administration plan to increase transparency and accessibility. And I should have said on that last slide, there is also a map to kind of show you, based on information from the census, where we prioritize our locations. Sacramento is a mix of very concentrated, dense populations and also very rural populations. So obviously we want to prioritize where the voters are. So this last slide just provides some links that you can use to help start your own VAAC with your election official, including a county VAAC toolkit, and also the Secretary of State's website has a lot of great information as well. And if you do need any help, or if you have any follow-up questions or things you want to talk over with me to get into more details about our VAAC, how it works, how we solve problems and issues, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Courtney. This is Megan at CFILC. Again, I believe we're going to question and answer here, and we do have one in our Q&A. They want to know how they can join their voter accessibility advisory committee, or who should they contact?
That's a great question. So to join your local county's voting accessibility advisory committee, you should reach out to your local county official. Some counties require a formal application and some don't. So it's kind of a general on what they ask. And we have where we have an application, we don't require it, but we have an application just to help us understand more about the member. What things are you interested in? What are your goals? Do you have a disability yourself? Any special projects you're working on? So we use the application more to just help us get an understanding of the committee member. But even if you can't commit to being a committee member, even just calling in for your VAACs, they are public meetings, so the public is welcome to attend. So even if you can't make that commitment to be a member, or you're not sure you want to be a member, call in, check it out, see if it's something you're going to be interested in. Because again, really every person and every perspective really helps.
Thanks, Courtney. I did have list some good ideas for organizations to attempt to collaborate with when trying to get the initial conversations going. What are some good organizations that seem to be pretty reliable in coming to the table in most communities, would you say?
So I think for us, and of course, this is definitely the Northern California perspective. I know different areas of the state will have different contacts. Resources for Independent Living, definitely. Disability Rights California, definitely. We've also have a great partnership with our California Council of the Blind and Sacramento Society for the Blind that has provided us really valuable input. Even though we don't have committee members from that group, they still regularly participate, and we appreciate that. Also, NorCal Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. We just kind of started up a relationship with them, I would say, over the last year or so. And that's really been eye-opening for election officials, especially me, realizing the barriers to even registering to vote. Secretary of State just put out a great video on how to complete a voter registration form in American Sign Language. We're also trying to get the political parties to provide their information in American Sign Language as well. Because I don't know if any of you have read the political party statement of purposes, but you know, they're tough to read. Even if you have, a college literacy rate, they're very challenging to read and understand. So that's really been eye-opening for us. We also have members that we've contacted just through assisted living centers. And I'm trying to think where else we've had. Of course, our disability compliance office was huge as well. And media release, we put out a media release, which got us some membership and participation with folks that specialize in website accessibility. So that was kind of very helpful as we were upgrading and changing our website.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Those are some great resources. And I also want to say that we are here also at the Do Network able to assist you in finding some of these resources in your local area. Many of the resources that Courtney mentioned are local to the Sacramento area. Some of them are a little bit more regional. First, we have Understanding Your Rights as a Voter under the 2020 elections due to COVID-19. And finally, Disability Rights California, or DRC, as a voting rights resource. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Jason Connor and Gabe Taylor, voting rights advocates at Disability Rights California.
All right. Thank you, Russell, so much for the introduction. And so we are talking, we're going to share a little bit about, first off, tell you a little bit about Disability Rights California as an organization and sort of what our focus is. And then we're going to go into a little bit more on what people can expect and should be able to expect when it comes to voting accessibility at the polling places or vote centers, and what resources are available to people who may need different accommodations. And then we will transition over to talk a little bit more about what folks can expect in terms of the changes due to all the COVID-19 restrictions. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. One of the things that Jason and I will both sort of say several times throughout this presentation is the fact that things are always changing constantly. And so what is happening now and what is being planned out now may be different come 3 months from now when the November election cycle officially kicks off. And so just to kind of keep that in mind and to be aware that that's always a changing thing. So okay. Oh, good. So just a little bit of background on Disability Rights California. We are a statewide protection and advocacy nonprofit organization. We've been around since about 1978, and we provide advocacy services for individuals with disabilities, a wide range of advocacy services. So Jason and I work specifically with our voting rights unit, but we cover issues like housing, transportation, education. We work with people who are institutions, people who have been hospitalized, IEPs, just a wide range of different services. So, but the grant that we particularly, our voting rights group and our work under the voting rights team is covered under the PAVA grant. So it covers basically everything that we do having to do with voting. So first and foremost, our work is always focused on people being able to have as private and independent a voting experience as possible. And that's sort of throughout the whole process, whether it's filling out your voter registration card or getting information on ballot measures or candidates, or completing your ballot, to be able to have different options when you're doing that, depending on what your accessibility needs are. We work to make sure that counties are doing everything that they can on their end to make that possible. In terms of providing procedures, and then also to the voting systems themselves, making sure that the voting systems are plugged in and working properly and available to people. That's one of the biggest things that we see as an ongoing issue, is that we're constantly having to work with counties to make sure that not only do they have the accessible voting machines, but that they're set up and that they're working properly. So, so now Jason will share a little bit more about general voting accessibility throughout the state.
Thanks, Gabe. So hi, everyone. I'm Jason Connor. I am a staff attorney with the Voting Rights Practice Group at DRC. And so I'm just going to sort of give a broad overview of voting accessibility in California. What are the main requirements? What are the main rights? Courtney, in her presentation, touched upon a lot of these, and so what I'm going to try to do is sort of contextualize that in more of a statewide, sort of through a statewide lens. So first, let's talk about in-person voting. So there are 3 basic accessibility requirements with in-person voting: accessible polling places, accessible voting systems, and assistance for voters with disabilities. So with accessible polling places, and so each of these, and this is something that's, this is sort of a busy slide, but something that's demonstrated is that these federal laws, which you see the acronyms for, and I'll explain those, sort of create these requirements that the state must promulgate. So in the first instance, that's the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, passed way back in the 80s. And that basically requires that there be physically accessible polling places in each precinct within the state and within the county. So election officials under the Secretary of State in California's guidelines must make every reasonable effort to select polling places that are accessible to voters with disabilities. And if they're not accessible, there's another California law that makes sure, and this is something, again, Courtney touched upon, that there is a curbside voting option for those who cannot physically access the polling place. So that's the first sort of major in-person voting accessibility requirement in the state. Second, we have accessible voting systems. HAVA, or the Help America Vote Act, that was an act passed in 2002. That's a federal statute, and it requires that there be at least one accessible voting system or ballot marking device per polling place. So not only do you have accessible polling places, but you have to have at least one accessible voting system within each polling place. And finally, there's assistance for voters with disabilities, and this goes way back to the VRA, or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allows voters with disabilities, and indeed allows any voter, to bring up to 2 people to assist them with voting at a polling place. And it can't be your employer, it can't be your union, a member of your union or an employer's agent, but you can bring other people to actually assist you at the polls. Awesome. Okay. So those were the 3 requirements for in-person voting, but just to touch upon the major requirements in California for mail voting, or vote by mail. So the first one, there are 2 major ones that you can find in the California Code. The first one is third-party designation for a ballot return. So what that means is basically, if you are a voter and you are unable to physically mail in your ballot, and that's required under California law. If you're voting by mail, you have to mail in the physical ballot, or you have to return it to a polling place or a vote center or a ballot drop-off box. And if you're not able to do that, you can actually designate a third person, and this can be anyone, to return that ballot on your behalf. So that's part of the California Code. Secondly, and incredibly important for this election and elections going forward, for the for the disability community is, and this is something that Courtney discussed at length, which Sacramento County does, but this is remote accessible vote by mail. So that, as Courtney explained, it allows voters with disabilities to access their ballot online through an online portal, and they download that ballot and they can mark that ballot using their assistive technology, the same technology they would use to navigate the web, check their email. They can actually mark their ballot. But really importantly is that you still have to print that ballot and have a physical copy that you either mail back to the election officials or you return in person at a vote center, a polling place, or a ballot drop-off box. So again, this is something that's important and something Courtney mentioned, but remote accessible vote by mail is not internet voting. And as advocates, that's an important messaging because that's something that, that tends to be a criticism of accessible vote by mail, the criticism that exists, but it actually isn't internet voting because even though you use the internet to access the ballot, print it off, and even mark it, you still have to print it physically and return it physically. So again, those are the 5 in-person and vote by mail voting accessibility rights in California. And I'll turn it over to Gabe to go over voting in a Voters' Choice Act county.
So voting in a Voters' Choice Act county. So there are a lot of changes that happened in excuse me, in a number of counties starting back in 2018. The VCA was state law passed in 2016 that allowed certain counties to conduct vote by mail elections. The VCA counties, in VCA counties, all registered voters are sent a vote by mail ballot a month before the election. So instead of having in-person polling places, the county, any VCA county that was working towards becoming a VCA county and instituting this model would establish vote centers. So like with polling places, there were one polling place for every 1,000 voters. There were less numerous vote centers, so it was one for every 10,000 voters for in-person voting. But they also had numerous ballot drop box locations for vote by mail ballots. So those would be located at different areas around the county. So that was increased the convenience of the process for people who had received their ballot and maybe didn't want to go in person to a vote center. So vote centers and ballot drop-off locations are required to be accessible, and they must each have at least 3 accessible voting systems. So one of the things that a lot of the counties that moved forward, they had 5 test counties beginning in 2018. And the 5 test counties did a lot of community meetings and got a lot of feedback from different populations, including the disability population, on vote center locations, ballot drop-off locations, just making sure that those locations would be accessible and workable for all different types of voters. So currently we have, as I mentioned, in 2018, 5 counties, Madera, Napa, Nevada, San Mateo, and Sacramento, adopted the Voters' Choice Act in 2018. 10 additional counties, including LA County, adopted the VCA beginning in March of 2020. So you can see the map listing all of the counties that are currently participating with the VCA. But in all of those counties, they did a lot of feedback, getting information on, especially like in counties where, say like LA County and Orange County, they asked the public to propose different vote center locations. So the public was able to go and participate and be part of the process, and suggest and submit locations that they thought would be helpful and accessible and convenient locations to be used as vote centers. So that was really, really good. Let's see. Looks like we lost the presentation.
Yeah, I think we might be having connection issues. We apologize to the attendees.
Yes.
There we go. Thank you,
Okay.
Megan.
Thank you, Megan, very much. Next slide, please. So vote centers are required to be open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day. In the March election and back in 2018, with the 5 test counties, most vote centers were open for 10 days prior to the election. And they had a certain number that were open. They increased the number, and so they had even more locations available starting 3 days prior to the election. So, but there were available vote center locations starting for 10 days out from election day. So from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. For about a week and a half prior to election day, people could go to vote in person at a vote center. The other great thing about the vote centers is that people aren't limited to going to one assigned polling place in their precinct. They can go to any one that they may be close to. Say if they're having lunch with a friend, they can go out, and they want to drop off their ballot after they finish lunch. They can go to their county elections website that should have the information posted as to where the nearest vote center location is to their address, and be able to go to that vote center. Voters are able to return their completed mail ballots through the mail, or they can drop them off at any one of the vote centers or drop-off locations in their county. Next slide, please. The other really great thing about the VCA structure is that voters in VCA counties, as with most counties now throughout the state, you can do same-day conditional voter registration. So you can go to even on election day, you can go to any one of your vote center locations, walk in, say, I'd like to register to vote, and you can complete a provisional ballot that then will be cast once your voter registration gets processed. So that's really helpful and really convenient to know about, and to pass along to any of the community groups or community partners that you work with, or consumers. Voters will also be able to vote in multiple languages. All counties are required to provide information in their voter information packets in multiple languages. Ballots are in multiple languages, and also the voting systems that each county uses have the ability to be able to, for voters to be able to access different languages using the ballot marking device. Each vote center location has at least 3 accessible voting machines. So one of the sort of priorities that we work with, again, is to make sure that those voting systems and voting machines are set up and working properly. So we work with the county elections officials to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to make sure that happens. So I will now turn it over to Jason, who will talk a little bit about sort of the changing election landscape and what voting will look like in November due to all of the COVID-19 restrictions.
Thanks, Gabe. Hey, everyone. So the next few slides, these are really important because there are quite a few changes because of COVID-19. And something we'll say again and again, and this is what something Gabe mentioned, is that even though in the next few slides we're going to try to give you the best picture that we can about what elections will look like statewide, this still is subject to change, because even though we have some legislation and executive orders, which we'll discuss, anything can happen, lawsuits can be filed, and there can be changes going ahead. But as of today, this is sort of what we know. So next slide, please. So there are two major sort of legal documents that are affecting the changes due to COVID-19. The first one is the executive order that Governor Newsom signed on June 3rd, 2020. So that requires all counties send registered voters a vote by mail ballot, and it allows counties to sort of consolidate their polling places if they're non-VCA counties. But they have to meet certain requirements. Well, I'll get into that in detail in the next few slides. The second sort of legal document affecting elections in 2020 is AB 860. That's Assembly Bill 860, and that's also a very recent law, and that sort of codifies some of the executive orders, an earlier executive order that we're not going to mention here that Governor Newsom signed. It expands vote by mail in certain ways, really important ways, and it has other things that are designed to help voters vote in ways that are accessible and convenient, but also safe because of the pandemic. Important to note, this is just a broad stroke over everything, is that the changes from these two legal documents only apply to the November 2020 election. This has nothing to do with any other special or national or state or local elections going forward. This is sort of emergency lawmaking that's happening just to make sure that the election in 2020 goes smoothly and safely. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over the two main voting options based on these changes in 2020. So this is about the November election, and the first voting option is voting by mail, and the second, which we'll get to in about 2 slides, is in-person voting. So again, that's sort of how we started this presentation off. With voting accessibility requirements and rights. It's sort of that duality of, am I going to vote in person or am I going to vote by mail? So in 2020, voting by mail is option 1. So all registered voters are going to receive a vote by mail ballot about a month before the election. So as we were explaining, in VCA counties like Sacramento, this sort of was already the case in those 15 counties. Now it's the case statewide for the November election. And this is to ensure health and safety and to maximize turnout, so people, aren't disenfranchised simply because they don't feel safe enough or they're vulnerable, like the disability community, to go and vote in person. So this is a major change. It's going to apply to all counties in the November 2020 election, and that's because of AB 860. Another thing AB 860 does is it allows all registered voters, not just voters with disabilities and overseas military voters, but all voters, to use the remote accessible vote by mail system. This is something Courtney touched upon in her presentation, but this is really crucial because not only are all registered voters going to receive a physical mail ballot that they can fill out, but they also have the option of using their county accessible vote by mail portal to access their ballot online, download it, mark it, and again, print it and mail it or return it physically. So that's the second major change that AB 860 does. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of a continuation of the first option, which is voting by mail. And this is just sort of information on the requirements and the deadlines around returning your ballot. So voters, obviously, they can return their ballot. They'll be able to return their ballot with prepaid postage provided in their voting packet or provided through the accessible vote by mail sort of printout. But the thing is, and this is something that actually applies to all elections. Everything needs to be postmarked by election day to be counted. The major difference for the November 2020 election in California is that under AB 860, excuse me, all ballots that are postmarked by election day, they have to be counted, even if they're received 17 days after the election. So that's over 2 weeks after the election. But as long as they were, received and processed by the mailing sort of agency and they were postmarked on election day, they still have to be counted. And this is just a side note, but this is sort of something to anticipate in 2020, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, but just by the language of that new sort of election requirement, that expansion of the counting deadline, we have to anticipate that the results of the 2020 election might take a while. We're not going to know the results on election night because a lot of this processing is going to take a while. And thankfully, in California, under AB 860, it's giving election officials more time. It's demanding that they actually give the voters more time to count their ballots as long as they're postmarked by election day. And secondly, and this was something I discussed when we were talking about voting accessibility in California, when we were talking about voting by mail. You can designate a third person or another person to return your ballot, your mail ballot, whether that's the mail ballot that was mailed to you by the election officials or the one that you printed out with accessible vote by mail. You can designate someone else, a family member, a friend, whatever have you, to return that ballot either by mail or in person. There is a requirement that that person must present some form of ID if they're returning in person, but otherwise that person can return it for you. So that's an important thing that we're just revisiting, but I explained to you all this requirement earlier. Next slide, please. Right, so the last two slides, that was voting option 1 in 2020. If you're voting by mail, you're going to receive your mail ballot a month before the election, and also everyone can use remote accessible vote by mail, right? So voting in person is slightly different also, but an important thing, and I'll skip to the last sort of bullet in this slide already, is that what I'm about to tell you for in-person voting, these are voluntary sort of suggestions made by the governor's executive order. What we talked about in vote by mail, those are requirements. So election officials are required to send everyone, all registered voters, a ballot a month before the election. And they're required to open up their accessible vote by mail systems to all voters. Now, voting in person, under this option, election officials are given the option of doing these sort of modifications, but they are not required to be doing these sort of modifications. So the first one allows non-VCA counties, so counties that aren't under the VCA, to actually consolidate their polling places, similarly to how vote centers consolidate where you can vote. So instead of having one polling place per 1,000 voters, you can have a polling place for 10,000 voters. But the requirements for that is that those non-VCA counties open the consolidated polling places up 3 days before the election through the election day, and that they maintain ballot drop-off locations from October 6th through election day, so about a month before to election day. So it's sort of like a quasi-VCA sort of requirement. It's saying you can reduce the number of in-person voting because we want people to have accessible mail voting and stay safe. You can reduce it, but you have to open it for early voting, and you have to make sure those drop-off locations are available and accessible for people returning their ballots. So that's one thing that the executive order allows, doesn't require, but it allows non-VCA counties to do. The second thing, and this is to VCA counties like Courtney and Sacramento, is that it allows vote centers, the vote centers in those counties, in the VCA counties, to only be open to the 3-day early voting before election day instead of the 10-day requirement. So again, in a usual election, you have to maintain at least one vote center per 50,000 voters 10 days before the election. But this allows VCA counties to, reduce that need to have an in-person voting, which increases risk for COVID exposure, and and just have the 3-day voting. But again, and I'll caveat that by saying VCA counties, who are very prepared, they're going to have a lot of safety measurements in place. So some of the counties might say, and I think this is true about Sacramento County, they might say, we're still going to have some vote centers open for the 10-day early period, and we're not going to opt in for this 3-day limitation. So again, those are the two major changes that the executive orders allow, but does not require of counties, both VCA and non-VCA. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Gabe just to wrap things up and give everyone resources moving forward, just generally, and also from DRC specifically. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. So one of the most important things, especially as it gets closer to November, is to be aware of how many resources and where to get your resources to get more information on not only the candidates, but also information on any state ballot measures that are coming up for decision. And because if any of you all voted or were part of the elections process in 2016, there were, I think, well over 20 plus different propositions that were being voted on. And the thing that's really important to be aware of is where to go to get more information. Whether it's, I always encourage folks to, if they have family or friends that they talk to about politics or elections, or to have conversations with them. There are also, and I'll explain some on the next slide, a number of really helpful online resources for good information on different topics. And then also the most important thing for folks to remember, and for you all to share with your clients and consumers and community members, is that folks need to be aware that they don't have to fill out every single contest on the ballot. They just to be aware that they can literally vote for one or two things on an entire ballot, and the ballot will still be counted. So that's something that I always really remind people, because I think people oftentimes feel that that it's their obligation to complete everything on all of the contests on a ballot, and that's not the case. And then finally, I just recommend that folks bring any materials that would be helpful to them, whether it's their sample ballot or notes or materials with them that might be helpful when they're marking their selections. So next slide, please. So these are some of the online resources that are available. The SOS has some really great helpful information, especially right now. They provide pretty frequent and regular updates on any of the COVID-19 developments and how that may impact elections moving forward in your county. And they also have they're also fairly current as to what's going on a statewide level. If there's anything, any major decisions regarding voting or elections being made on a statewide level, it's a really great resource. Also, it's helpful because it provides information on the voter registration process, and also has a link to be able to, for folks to be able to complete an online voter registration form if they need to register or re-register. So that's always helpful. Voter's Edge is another great resource. It provides information on local contests to your area. You just basically fill in your voter registration address, and it will call up all of the local contests and any state or county measures that are being voted on. And it's just, and also it oftentimes will include links to candidate statements that have been drafted by any of the candidates running for particular offices. So it's a very helpful resource for people to turn to if they're needing information or sort of trying to make decisions on local contests in their area. And then voterschoice.org is the premier resource for all things VCA related. It has a really good summary and history of the Voters' Choice Act and how it got started as SB 450, and it has also a really great section, frequently asked questions, that provides some really great information. So really a good resource. And the last one is the easyvoterguide.org. And this is the link to, or the online link to the League of Women Voters Easy Voter Guide. It's a really, really helpful resource, particularly during the elections that have a lot of state bills or ballot measures or propositions included on the ballot. It provides a very helpful and thorough breakdown of what the proposition is or state ballot measure is, and then also it gives a very good explanation of if you vote yes for that proposition, here's what that will do, and then if you vote no, here's what that will do, and then it gives information on who supports particular propositions and who opposes them. And it's a very helpful way to kind of break it down and make it very easy to understand. So it's a really great resource. I oftentimes I'll, especially as it gets closer to the election, I will bring copies of the Easy Voter Guide with me to any of my trainings that I do in person, and just hand them out to folks so they have another resource to be able to look at when they're trying to make their decisions. So next slide. So finally, this is the listing for DRC's voting hotline. We provide it as a service primarily during election season, but it's available now 24/7 for folks who have just general voting questions, or if they received something in the mail regarding voting or elections in their county and are curious about it. Feel free to direct them to our voting hotline. It's staffed by me, Jason, and then we have 3 other staff members that are field calls that come into our hotline, and it will be one of the 5 of us getting back with you to see what we can do to assist you. But it's very helpful, and we work with a lot of the counties, Sacramento included, and a lot of them have been really great, and they include our hotline number in their voter information packets that get sent out to people automatically. So it's a really great resource that we try and share to people, just so they, in case they have questions or accessibility issues come election time. So with that, we would open up the discussion to questions if folks have them. And thank you all, and thank you, Russell and Megan and Courtney, for participating with us and making this happen. We really appreciate the time and the opportunity to share with you all what's going on currently with voting and elections right now. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Great. This is Megan, and we do already have a few questions that came in. And I think we have about 15 minutes left here. So if folks do have questions, please feel free to send them to us in Q&A. But the first one here is from Eric, and they want to know, how do we get a county to follow the VCA?
Yeah, Courtney, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I saw that one and I was like, oh, maybe I'll chime in on that one. So, it's a great question. There's really two big barriers for a county that might be hesitant in joining the VCA. One is political and one is resources. Sacramento County moved to the Voters' Choice Act after we knew we had to replace our voting system. So we had to go to purchase a brand new voting system. If counties have purchased a new system or they weren't planning on spending a lot of money, it's going to be hard for them to make that change because they will need millions of dollars to do that. The other kind of issue is political. And we had a little bit of that in Sacramento. Sacramento is a purple county, you would say, a mix of different political parties. So, you might have a board of supervisors, even outside the election official, that says, no, absolutely not. We're not going to make this move. When we moved to Voters' Choice Act in 2018, all other county election officials were elected. Sacramento was the only one appointed registrar, I should say. So what that means is that we had to rely on the board to make that decision. So the Board of Supervisors really made that choice for us, while the elected registrars more went to their board as an advisory instead of asking for permission. So it really depends, but just talk to your local election official, explain why you do want to move to the VCA, and see what they say in terms of resources and perhaps replacing a voting system.
And I will just add too, I think one of the things that helps in terms of the successful implementation of the VCA is a willingness on both the community side and also the county election side to be a part of the process. And one of the things that before we got on the call, we were talking about the importance of the VAAC committees and the fact that they're really crucial in terms of providing information and also feedback to the county election staff on different points in the planning process for VCA implementation. And to registrar's credits like Courtney, I mean, she's been very involved and works very closely with the VAAC and is very engaged with the disability community in ways that I think are really helpful when it comes to accessibility. And so just encouraging your county elections officials to engage different communities and really participate in the dialogue as much as possible in ways like folks like Courtney have. So I think, so thank you, Courtney, for being as engaged and being a part of the process as you have been, because I think that's what really leads to it being successful.
Thank you all. And Eric, if that did not get to your question, please let us know.
Yeah, Megan, sorry to jump in, and just before you continue, and just to reiterate Courtney and Gabe's point, but something I will say, and this might be a little speculative, but I think, after November's election, based on the changes we were discussing, requirements and, allowances alike, we might see election officials on their own accord sort of switch over to the VCA anyway, because a lot of these allowances, all voters receiving a mail ballot and potential consolidation, in some ways it does resemble sort of a VCA procedure. So we might see election officials look at that and say, this went really well. It was convenient for X, Y, and Z. And like, as Courtney says, if the politics are there and the resources are there, then we might be seeing that happening to a greater degree going forward. But That's what I'll say. Sorry, Megan.
That's all right. Thank you, Jason, for adding that. We have a question here that says, how can I get a copy of this webinar? Disability Organizing Network will have this archive webinar with captions and the transcript available online within 2 weeks. And then we have a comment/question here from Janet, who says, I was a voting poll supervisor years ago, and to be honest, I only remember having a separate area with a bigger table for people with disabilities at the location where I was stationed. I'm glad to be a part of this meeting and learn more about this topic, and we're glad you're here too, Janet. Thank you for joining. We have about 10 minutes here. If folks have more questions, feel free to send them to us. And Russell, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Thanks, Megan. Yes, thank you all for participating, and thank you to our presenters, Jason, Gabe, and Courtney. And we just have a couple of next action steps that we'd like to engage with you on. This final slide here in the deck has some next steps for all of you. First and foremost, of course, be sure to register to vote. And there is a link that will be active in the slide deck that you'll be receiving after the webinar. There is also a link to join the Disability Organizing Network. We will have upcoming 2020 disability voting education webinars, including one that is more in-depth on the changes this November. Some of those are subject to change as Gabe and Jim mentioned, and we will have an in-depth what's changed webinar that will be the end of August. And then finally, we will have a Get Out the Vote centered webinar that will be happening in late September. And then third, you can contact your county elections office. That's really the starting point for all of these conversations, as you heard with Courtney, is that getting to know your elections office, your county elections office, is so crucial in building the relationship and starting advocacy work. And then fourth is to develop the bigger advocacy circle, start having meetings with folks, develop a voter accessibility advisory commission if you can. And even if you can't, it's good to have the informal meetings where you can then collectively communicate with your county elections office on the needs of voters with disability in your area and start strategizing, and perhaps eventually that will then form a voter accessibility advisory committee for your county. And then finally, stay informed with updates from the Secretary of State. And this is a link to the Secretary of State's website, the section that is specifically for voting. So I'd just like to encourage all of you again to connect with us. We will be having regular voting access meetings coming up. Those will be starting in the month of August. So we invite all of you to connect with us by joining with that join link there in this last slide. There will also be a survey that will be sent out after this webinar. We are interested to know what you took from this, if you've successfully engaged with the VAAC, or maybe you're already a member of one. We'd love to hear from you and connect with you throughout this election season. So again, I want to just take a moment to see if there are any final questions, either for myself in the organizing side of this work or for any of our panelists. If not, I think I've got one good question left for the entire panel, but I'd love to hear from the attendees. Great. Yeah, I'd love to hear from our panelists. What are some new and emerging barriers that you're seeing for November? Is there anything that we should be, that disability voting rights advocates should be especially aware of? And Gabe and Jason, this may be more for you, especially kind of statewide. Are we seeing any trends?
The one thing I will say in terms of, because a lot of the counties have moved or are in the process of moving over to using new voting equipment, and so that's a new learning curve for the whether it's the vote center staff or the poll workers. So just as part of that process, it's always really helpful, and I would encourage any of the advocates who do regular work with your county elections officials to provide trainings and presentations whenever possible, even if it's virtually through a Zoom setup, but to provide them with, still given everything going on and all of the changes taking place, making sure that they're doing everything that they need to do to provide accommodations and assistance to people with disabilities, making sure that the accessibility equipment for the voting systems is turned on and working. I myself have gone to vote in person and had the audio headset. It was there and plugged in, but it was still, it still had twist ties on it. So little things like that, that there's a lot of things that the poll workers and the vote center staff are trying to keep in mind, but just to be that nudging reminder to say, okay, well, we understand, but you still can't forget about accessibility and providing assistance to people who need, voters with disabilities who need that. So, and Jason, I will let you chime in too if you have any.
Sure, thanks, Gabe. Yeah, just keeping an eye, as voters yourselves and advocates, keeping an eye on the polling places and the vote centers that you see for, obvious accessibility issues. And like Gabe said, and sort of Courtney's presentation addressed, showing up when possible, virtually or otherwise, to community meetings where election officials are present to receive feedback and input is so important. Especially in counties with multiple polling places and vote centers, they need to know the issues, whether, like Gabe illustrated, it's an accessibility machine that hasn't been plugged in or just isn't ready to receive voters. These are things that really need to be reinforced and repeated until they're fixed, because as we try to explain in our presentation, they're the rights of all Californian voters, and you should work with your election officials to accomplish these, because there are procedural, political, and resource barriers, but it should be the end goal ultimately at the end of the day. So just be engaged, be vigilant, and hopefully, and as we hope, November is as accessible and successful as it can be for all voters in California.
And also, I just will say one, final note that, making sure that you're staying engaged, and it's all about providing positive as best as possible, and as often as possible, providing positive assistance and ahead of time, because it's, if you're engaged in the process leading up to election day, it makes election day work so much more smoothly than if you're engaging after the fact. If there's a problem that you hear about after election day, then it doesn't really, it still creates it still means that there's a problem, and that there was that folks weren't able to have a truly accessible voting experience on election day. So trying to engage ahead of time and make those meetings with your county elections officials, or if there's any community meetings that are being scheduled or planned, even if it's through Zoom setup, engage and attend those meetings, because it's really, really important, and it's very helpful for the county elections officials later on.
This is Megan, and we are at our time. So thank you to our presenters, Gabe, Jason, and Courtney for joining, Russell for organizing, and of course our captioner for providing access. And this archive will be available on the Disability Organizing Network website within 2 weeks. And Russell, do you have any last parting words?
I'd just like to thank everyone for their time today, and thank you for bearing with us with the technical difficulties. This webinar will also be producing an accompanying fact sheet that will be available with the help of our disability voting advocates. Thank you all to all of the panelists, and we look forward to seeing you again in August.